Welcome back to the Arthur Jeffrey Centre podcast. I'm Dr. Richard Schumacher. I'm the director of the Arthur Jeffrey Centre at Melbourne School of Theology. In this short podcast series, we've been looking at Hamas, trying to help people understand what Hamas is, what Hamas is trying to achieve in its conflict with Israel currently. I'm joined, as usual, by Dr. Mark Drury, my colleague. Good to see you, Mark. I believe you've just come off another media appointment. Who were you talking to earlier today?
I was interviewed by Andrew Bolt about what's been happening. He was concerned. He was puzzling over the anti-Semitism that's been observed, and also the struggle that the Australian authorities seem to have had in dealing with that. Just trying to help people understand. So yeah, it was. Andrew's been interviewing me on and off over the years on lots of different occasions, and so it's good to be there. So wanting to, but with the conflict in the Middle East, there's lots of work. Actually, there's a lot of people don't know what to make of things, and so there's calls on our time that have been unexpected.
I agree. It's a pressing question, and particularly the rise of anti-Semitism is perplexing. I'm not surprised Andrew's interested. We won't tackle that directly today, but I assume we'll see that somewhere on Sky News perhaps shortly.
Yes, it'll be out there tonight. So people can. I'm sure it'll be able to follow it later.
Keep an eye out on the Sky News channel for clips of that. It is relevant to what we're talking about today. If you've been following along with us, we spent some time just identifying Hamas as what we've been calling a transnational or international Islamist movement. It longs to see Islam established and ruling certainly the Middle East, and at the very least all the lands that Islam have conquered over its time. And that's certainly driving it ideologically and what's happening at the moment. We talked a little bit too about what was the attitude within Hamas that led it to believe that it could achieve, as such a small organization, that it could achieve the victory it was after. But today I want to dig a bit more into just the questions of peace, really. What are given the Hamas mindset, what are the prospects for peace in the Middle East? Particularly in Israel. And so, Mark, maybe what would certainly help me is last time we sort of mentioned that this conflict is sitting on top of literally thousands of years of disputes, land disputes, military conquests, imperialism from Persian to Babylonian to Roman to Greek. If you want to pick your colonizers, there's no end. It's just such a messed up bit of land. But even just recently, going back to the establishment of Israel, like what was the hope when it was set up by the UN around World War II? What was the hope? How was it ever going to work to fit everyone in? What was the goal?
Well, the League of Nations back at the beginning of the 20th century gave, after the First World War, when the Ottoman territories were sort of divided up between the great powers of Europe, Britain was given a mandate to establish a homeland for the Jews and to thereby be able to welcome Jews into that area.
If I remember right, is that the Balfour Agreement or the Balfour Declaration?
Yeah, it was related to that. There was a commitment to provide a safe homeland for the Jews there. And at the same time, in the late 19th century, there had emerged a Zionist aspiration, which was actually a new thing amongst Jews. I mean, of course, Judaism is very much focused on land. It's a central part of the Bible, the promise of land to the people of Israel. And the story of the Bible is about exile and return. It's a very deeply embedded narrative in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures. But that didn't necessarily mean that Jews were kind of actively expecting to go back to Israel or to return. But in the late 19th century, perhaps influenced by Christian Zionism, Jews began to develop the aspiration of establishing a safe place, a Jewish state. And so Britain had that task of making that possible. The Palestinian mandate included both the lands to the west of the Jordan and also to the east of the Jordan. So they were all part of the mandate. And then that was divided into two. So the British invited basically an Arab family to be the king of Jordan, to provide the king of Jordan. Actually, the population of Jordan is mainly made up today of Palestinians.
Yes, correct.
And there are also Bedouin. And in a way, the Bedouins have been the kings. As one person said to me recently, Arab nations are the most stable when minorities are in power. And that's the case in Jordan. You've got a kind of Bedouin traditional family there. They're no longer living in tents, but they're the royal family. And so anyway, the British did this deal and they separated off the eastern part of the mandate, the east of the Jordan. And then the western part was an area that Jews could come into, seeking refuge from Eastern Europe and other Muslim lands and so on. And there were people coming in from throughout the Muslim world as well from the late 19th century. But the Arabs at the same time had been promised by the British in the First World War that they'd have national self-determination. And there was a movement beginning in the end of the 19th century to establish an Arab identity, an Arab national, and the nation of the Arabs, as it were. So the British had sort of promised the Arabs that they'd be able to have self-determination once they'd thrown off the yoke of the Ottomans. But also they had this mandate to establish a safe place for the Jews, and that was creating enormous tension. And numbers of...
It's probably... Just quickly, it's a fascinating thing that I don't think many people, many Westerners have in their imagination that the shape of the Middle East that we look at now, they weren't countries until about 100 years ago when the Brits and the French created them with alliances. And so there was no Saudi Arabia, there was no Jordan, there was no Syria.
No,
these are all, right, no Iraq. These are all like arbitrary in a sense, brand new countries. So the idea that somehow the people of Israel have just been dropped into this stable situation is nonsense.
Yeah, there was no Palestine.
Right. Yeah, there was no Palestine. Right. Keep going.
It was the Ottomans administered Syria, which included the southern part, as part of their empire, but it wasn't a separate national entity. And I think the King of Jordan at a certain point would have been very happy for the Palestinians to be part of Jordan.
Right.
And there was in fact a Congress after the war, after the 1948 war, when Israel established its independence. There was a Congress in which, there was a welcoming of Jordan as the Palestinian homeland. At that point, Jordan had annexed the West Bank, so that the West Bank became part of Jordan at that point. So back into the 30s, you had this situation where large numbers of Jews were beginning to come in, and then the British basically put a quota. They implied a very strict quota on the numbers of Jews they'd let in at that time.
Just pause for a second. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt again. You say come in where? Like, where were they living?
Oh, they were coming from...
Whose land were they on? Where
they were coming from Europe. They were coming from Iraq. They were coming from Persia. I was just reading this morning an account of Persian Jews that had fled from persecution into Israel, into Palestine in the first few decades of the 20th century, and the local Arabs were absolutely furious at that. So they were coming from Morocco. They were coming from Egypt. From all over, but particularly, I think, large numbers from Eastern Europe, where conditions for Jews had been particularly bad.
Right, but where did they buy land? Like, they weren't invading. Yes. Were they renting?
Question.
Were they buying?
Great question. They weren't coming in late at night to steal land from people. They Most of Palestine was public land, so it was owned by the Ottomans, if you like. Mm-hmm. And there were individuals that owned farms and houses in villages and so on, but a lot of the land was public land. And when the Jews were coming in, they, in some cases, appropriated or bought that public land from the state, I believe. In other cases, they bought land from the Palestinians. And they brought in economic development and technological skills. So the economy flourished. And in fact, one of the complaints of the Arabs at that time in the 20s and 30s was the amount of land that the Jews were buying up from the Palestinians. They were, and this is still an issue today. There's still an issue of Jews buying land from Palestinians, and the Palestinians are upset about that. But they're selling the land as well at the same time. So it's certainly not the case that the Jews came in and took huge amounts of land that belonged and lived on by Palestinians at that time. It was much more complex and much less unjust than that implies. It wasn't a colonial power coming in with guns to try and steal land from people. It was migrants moving in and buying land and sometimes getting land from the state. So I think Tel Aviv was built on land that had been wasteland or desert land before, and was bought and established for a Jewish settlement.
Right, but just moving things along a little bit. But by the time we get to 1946, 1947, there was imposition of some sort, right? Land was taken and given, divided from on high, so to speak, in the agreements of 1947.
Yeah, so the UN, which replaced the League of Nations, tried to partition the land into a Jewish area and a Palestinian area. The Jews welcomed that with rapturous joy, and the Palestinians with great anger and bitterness. And so basically that triggered off a war between the Jews to establish Israel, and they were fighting against the Palestinian Arabs and also the surrounding nations, which declared war on them. So that's sort of, there was a partition plan which was rejected, and instead warfare imposed a partition plan in which Egypt ended up occupying the Gaza Strip, and Jordan annexed the West Bank, and Israel managed to hold some areas. In fact, they had a larger area than the UN had given them, would have given them. So it was to their advantage in a way, in that sense, that they had a bigger footprint on the land.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, the original partition plan wasn't quite 50-50, but it was roughly equal between the Jews and the Palestinians. It wasn't cut down the middle. It was a little bit complicated. The land was sort of spread in a few different areas, but it was roughly, the proposal at least that was not accepted was roughly 50-50. And then the Arab nations backed the Palestinians and there was a war. And then since then, the figures have changed, right? So roughly what are the figures now between...
Yes, I'm not sure exactly. I mean, I think it's the Palestinian land of the West Bank and Gaza would be down much lower, so 20%.
I think that's right.
Than what was originally planned. So the war didn't work out well for the Palestinians. And that was the first major decision point. They'd already rejected a two-state solution in the 30s, basically. But at the time when the UN tried to impose a two-state solution, they rejected it then, and they have repeatedly rejected a two-state solution. I mean, at the time, Jordan didn't want to have a separate Palestinian state. They wanted the West Bankers to be part of Jordan, and they expected that perhaps all of Palestine could become part of Jordan as well. I don't think Egypt annexed Gaza, but it administered it and kept it under its control. So I think down through history, the Palestinians, I believe, have repeatedly rejected a two-state solution. And there's two reasons for that. One is the Arab nationalist aspiration, that is that the land, they should have self-determination. The land is for the Arabs. You know, this was the movement of the earlier part of the 20th century. And the other is the religious impetus that this land has been conquered by Islam. This is the Hamas perspective, if you like. There's an interesting contrast between Hamas, which is a kind of purely religious objective, which is to establish a caliphate with Jerusalem as its capital. And Fatah is a more secular group, and their focus is more on Arab self-determination. But both those two perspectives have worked against a two-state solution. The two-state solution sort of is built on the idea that surely it's in everyone's best interest to get on and to coexist and to let the others continue. Or why wouldn't that happen? But you've got these two aspirations opposed to it.
Yeah, right. Like, it seems at least intuitively sensible that the only way it's going to work is if people share the space, particularly when, and we mentioned this last time, but it's not clear that either Palestinians or Jews have the most legitimate historical claim. They both seem to have valid claims to that being their homeland. We even talked about the movement of Jews into Palestine in the last century, but there's always been Jews there. It's not like they were ever wiped out completely. They were under Roman occupation. The numbers dwindled quite significantly and they were literally cast out. But so it seems like sharing is the most sensible way forward. And here's another thing. I can imagine people sitting here thinking, well, hang on. Even the name of Islam is related to peace. Like, Islam promotes itself as a religion of peace. Salam is the Arabic word for peace. Islam is like the status of being at peace, in a sense, at peace with God. At least that's what the word seems to mean. Give us, in a nutshell, I mean, you're our resident Islamic theology expert. Give us, is there such a thing as a Quranic doctrine of peace? Like, what are the prospects for trying to find a peaceful solution? Last time you talked about there's certainly unquestionably a theology of war in Islam. There's a jihad is real, struggle is real, killing is real. You talked about that, and Hamas is driven by that. But is there some sort of balancing or corresponding theology of peace that might lead to a peaceful solution?
Yes. There will be peace when Islam is victorious and everyone else surrenders. That's peace. That's Islamic peace. The land of peace. Yeah. Actually, salam actually means originally safety, not peace. And it's a state that arises when you surrender. So Aslin Taslam Muhammad used to say, surrender and you'll be safe. And so it's actually
so
this.
It's peace in the sense of we've stopped fighting. It's not reconciliation. So I think the way we tend to use peace is in that relational sense. We've made peace with each other. We've made peace with ourselves. That's not the sense of the term. It's more a sense of I lay down my weapon before you. I've sort of parlayed for peace. It's more like
it's
that.
Pacification. It's pacification. You've become, in a sense, a slave.
And that's the truest sense of the meaning in Islam too. It's not that you and God are suddenly friends. It's that you've literally bowed down.
You've submitted.
God. You've submitted, right. So it's peace as submission, not peace as reconciliation and making friends. Yeah,
it's a security that comes from capitulation. But that's the Islamic peace.
Yeah. So how then, like, do we see that? Is that been the history of Islam? Muslims, particularly Western Muslims, will want to claim that it's a genuine or a rich and full peace. But was that the history of Christians living under Muslims?
Yeah, this is a really highly contested topic. It's a really highly contested topic. So there was a view that developed in Europe, particularly amongst Jewish scholars in the 19th century, that in the past there were these golden ages where Muslims and Jews and Christians lived together really happily, but only under Islam. So Islam is the one that has a kind of mandate, a calling to establish this harmony, this beautiful coexistence, convivencia, they sometimes call it.
Not only that, that's in the Hamas Accord. The Hamas Charter. I noticed that same idea that peace only comes when the Muslims are in charge.
Yeah, and when ISIS was rampaging, the King of Jordan called Christian leaders of the Middle East together to affirm the glorious nature of Islam's wonderful track record of providing peace to Christians and Jews and others. That was his response to ISIS. On the other hand, there's another interpretation that says that those times were literally times of submission, of denigration, of inferiority, of humiliation. And Jewish communities have always been persecuted and treated badly in Islamic context. Sometimes they've flourished more than others, but sometimes they've been treated very badly. I mean, I could give you many examples or instances of that. Just little examples, like in Yemen, if a Jewish child was orphaned, he had to be handed over to the Islamic authorities to be Islamized. And reports of visitors from America and Europe in Morocco or in the northwest of Africa in the 19th century described rape of Jewish women as being just normal part of their experience, and there was no redress for them at all. And there's a whole series of massacres, and particularly in the 19th century, that traumatized the Christian and Jewish world. The genocide of the Armenians is perhaps the most famous example, but there've been during the First World War, but there've been many attacks on different communities. The Yazidis were regularly hunted down and enslaved by the Ottomans in the 19th century. So what ISIS did to them was not exceptional. So yeah, there's the history of Christians and Jews living under Islam is, as I said, very controversial. And it's controversial because of this civilizational struggle. Like, you're going to buy into an Islamic view of history, in which case you accept the principle that Islam sort of should rule and bring peace to everybody. But it's a piece of surrender and dominance. Or do you actually give voice to the minorities as they became? Originally, they were majorities. These are conquered peoples living in their own lands who ultimately became minorities, very suppressed, oppressed, and were whittled away by Islam over a long period of time. So yeah, that's it's sometimes the Hamas and other groups have said, well, we'll accept some Jews in the land, but they'll be dhimmis, they'll be inferior, they'll be paying tribute, they'll be under our control, they'll have to follow Islamic law because we know that's the best law for everyone. So yeah, that's a pretty grim prospect actually, and it's a suppressed history.
And it's ironic. I mean, again, as we talked about last time, the perception is that the Palestinians are the oppressed people, but for Hamas, the ideology is that of a colonizing oppressor. It's peace in the similar sense to the Pax Romana. You had peace with Rome if you just submitted before it and fell into line and were willing to be occupied. And that's been the track record of colonializing imperial powers. That's imperialism writ large, and the Islamic ideology is the same.
That's a great point. It's a great point. And sometimes Hamas preachers have said, oh, we're not going to stop at Jerusalem. We'll conquer Rome. It's been prophesied by Muhammad, and we'll conquer London, and we'll conquer America, and even Japan. And occasionally you see these statements, and this is an imperialistic impetus. Absolutely. And this area was originally Christian. It's been Islamicized through force and through the application of discriminatory power. So yes, those that are supporting Hamas are supporting a nascent, imperial, brutal power. I mean, sometimes when I think of those protesters saying free Palestine, and I imagine what might well happen if that did happen and Israel was obliterated, that you'd have a Palestine ruled by Hamas. This is not free. This is actually imperialism on the loose, So
the prospects then for a genuine two-state solution seem grim. I mean, even as it was quite a bold statement that there is the theology of peace is simply of submission. There's nothing more, no more substance, and it feels a bit shocking to a Christian who will read words like forgiveness, God is forgiving, God is merciful. But I think it's helpful for Christians to understand that the gospel of Islam, if I blend those terms together, is not you can be forgiven by God and restored into a relationship with God. That's a very Christian conception. And Christianity at its heart is about peace as reconciliation. It's rich, it's personal, it's interpersonal. That is not Islam in any way, shape, or form. All that happens in Islam, it's like you go to a law court and the judge has mercy on you and relents from punishing you, but he doesn't forgive you because judges don't forgive. You don't have a relationship with the judge. It's a law court setting, and in fact, it's not even that. It's just, as you say, in Islam, you're a slave of your master, and mercy is for him not to punish you. So to try and impose or import the Christian idea of peace into Islam, it doesn't gel, it doesn't connect. Mark, thanks for joining us. Conscious that we're running low on time. There's more to be talked about. I want to pick up again on that, how we started on the question of anti-Semitism being on the rise. I'd love to dig into that a little more next time. But for now, thank you for joining us. And thank you, all our listeners and watchers, for joining us at the Arthur Jeffrey Center podcast. We hope to see you again next time.
Good to chat with you, Richard.
Thanks, Mike. See ya.